Some internet sites are designed so that if you constantly access them every couple of seconds or every couple of minutes, that they will interpret that as an attempt to bring down that website, that web server. And you want to make an internet accessible software program, but you don't want to run against the policies and preferences of that website. So, one of the ways that I address that in this particular development process is to download a copy of the data from the internet site that I ultimately want to have the program work with, right? So, in this case, I want this program to be able to work with the majority of internet sites that are out there on the web. And in order to do that, I want to create a format and I want to create a process that once it's stable offline, that when I turn the switch to have it access the internet online, that everything will go well. So that's what I'm setting up here. I've done some refactoring since the last time I've presented information on this, and I have a process here where I set up a feeds directory, and I do that through a function so that everything is not commingled or amalgamated in the main function. And I also create the static RSS files, right? The files that contain the RSS XML data. And I do it in this function here, and I have a comment up there. I know that the function name should be literate, as Dr. Donald Knuth espouses in his works. But sometimes a literate file name or variable name still isn't enough. So I made sure that I indicated what this central function does, which is in this design, the intent is to only create local versions of the RSS feed data if there is no file available that represents that RSS feed. And at this stage, the goal is not to have real-time data or representations of the RSS feed that we've chosen, but to have a solid representation of the format of that data so that we write a program that uses that format, interprets that format, and transforms it into actionable data and information within the program. So that's the overarching goal. And again, the way I go about that here is I am breaking up this process into discrete functions. My reasons for doing that is, one, I don't like code all in one place, right? It's more of an aesthetic preference, right? But I also want to have the maximum opportunity to reuse different parts of the code, right? You could take reusability too far, but in this case, I think we're on a good track here at the beginning. So here I have a function that is going to essentially be responsible for creating the static RSS file, that's going to encode a file with the RSS information from a particular RSS feed. And so this is me playing around with a few refactoring options and deciding that I don't have time for this at this moment, so I'm going to move on. This particular function, I'm looking towards the future of using it as a template for a different function involved in transforming the XML data into text-based data that I could then parse in a more common way, right? Now, the syndication API from Microsoft can also accomplish that. But if I was merely going to do that, then I wouldn't go through the process of integrating this this Microsoft API with the API I had custom developed. So I want to preserve that API so that I have the same overall design between Microsoft Windows and the Linux distributions, as well as sometime in the future Mac OS. The Windows version is going to be decidedly different from the Linux version as of right now, because the code is diverging rapidly, and that's fine. That's fine. And they can also, I've already decided, they can also look different as well. That's not really, the point is not to, is no longer to try to have a strict implementation that is the same across both operating systems. So as I've gone and made some changes, I'm building the program to make sure that there are no issues, no technical issues flagged by Visual Studio. And so far, so good in terms of keeping the code in a compilable state, right? During this particular session, and I don't necessarily show it in this video, but I've made several commits to the GitHub repository that I have at github.com/Michael Gaucher. And so I mentioned in a few videos back that I was having some issues doing a git push. It turns out that if you use GitHub Mobile, and this is just a side effect that I noticed, is that once you use that that access token through the GitHub Mobile app on your cell phone or on a tablet, that token remains resident on this Windows computer, in this Windows environment. So every time you do a push, it no longer asks you for a username and password or even a personal access token. It just uses whatever the code is that was negotiated between the GitHub mobile app, github.com, and your installation of Microsoft Windows with Git for Windows installed. So between those three, there is a handshake that occurs that establishes trust of this computer with GitHub. So anyway, I'm making a commit to the local Git repository, right? That's on this computer, and this is the commit where I have basically taken the function that creates the local RSS file and essentially made that a function, right? Rather than have that merged with the code that iterates through the different RSS feed names and URLs, right? I separated those and put those into different responsibilities and into different code paths. And I did some cleanup of my git ignore. I had the debug directory, no, the bin directory, which is the parent directory for the debug directory and the release directory. That was getting committed to the Git repository, and that's not something that I do, right? So that was an oversight that I have rectified using git rm remove, right? Git rm -rf. You know, I've done that a lot in the Linux environment, but I decided to go ahead and apply that process in the Windows environment, and so that got all of that cleaned up. This is me bringing up the help documentation, right? If you look at some of my earlier videos, I talk about the Microsoft Help Viewer, and I spend considerable time well, not exceptionally considerable time, but I spend quite a bit of time updating the help viewer anytime I install Visual Studio, and I periodically apply the updates. So it's my intention to use the local help viewer. But when I clicked the help, I sat there and I waited, and I realized that, yes, I remembered that by default it tries to open up online help in whatever the default browser is. So I'm going to change that to use the local help viewer application and the local offline help content. I am not connected to the internet during this development process, and indeed, during most development processes that I've done over the last 20 plus years, I try to avoid depending on the internet. In my previous video, the one prior to this, you do see me go into Stack Overflow and do Google searches and that sort of thing, and that's fine. But when at all possible, I try to keep everything self-contained, keep things offline, because that removes variables that, especially in this case, I don't need interacting with the development process that I'm undertaking. So I got the local help viewer opened up, and this is all of the install help guides that I had chosen, right? I removed some of the default ones, right? And I just wanted to click that to see what that is, and that's just something about going online and doing a check, and it's not a big deal. But these are some of the guides that I downloaded. I rarely use 90% of this, right? Every once in a blue moon, I might use the C# one, but my main one is the .NET API reference that you see at the top. That's my number one. And I use the index extensively when I do use a help viewer like this, right? There are similar things in a Linux environment, but I prefer an index-based search or index-based help system like this. I just find it extremely useful, or maybe it's just because that's what I had grown accustomed to in the earlier days of what used to be called Microsoft Help. There was a file format called .chm, which stood for compiled HTML, compiled help content. Anyway, there's a long story about all of that, and ActiveX, and then later DHTML, and et cetera, et cetera. So I'm in this help viewer, and I found the syndication API documentation. Despite this help documentation updating right here recently, it's still showing a date of 2018 for this particular part of the API. So there may be a discontinuity, right, between the offline help content and the online websites from MSDN, the Microsoft Developer Network, right? Maybe, but the documentation is still relevant, right? So it may just be missing a few details. But here I'm staring at these properties because that's the main thing I want to get down to the nitty gritty. Is that when I was developing this in a Linux environment, these are the type of attributes that I would notice across the different XML formats for RSS and Atom and so on. And here is that I see them and I'm like, oh, that's exactly what I was looking for, exactly what I wanted. And this alone saves me a considerable amount of time. We're talking about not even hours, but maybe a week, of actual time. So the time savings here for me is going to be absolutely substantial. So once I saw that was a huge boost of confidence, because what I mentioned in the earlier video about that code snippet on Microsoft's website that showed you how to use the API, it was very minimal, right? But this allows me to use my 7 years of experience dealing with RSS data, and it all matches up now, and I can actually apply that here without having to do too much research in terms of the Microsoft Syndication API. So what I have highlighted here is just a mere fact that this is going to be the main function that bridges between RSS information in XML format and RSS information that I'm going to put in more or less a tabular format, a linear tabular format, right? And so it already comes across in XML in a linear format, right? In terms of tags, right? Elements, XML elements, and that sort of thing. And the API then just presents that as properties, right? And methods. You can act on those properties and so on. But I already have a format, I already have a process, right, that I developed in the C++ version of this process, right, or the version of this process that I implemented in C++, right, in the Linux environment. And so I'm going to use that, right, that process, because in many ways the user interface that I have already implemented here in WPF is influenced based on that structure and that design. So I'm not going to do a wholesale redesign of the backend API and the backend data. My goal is to do the least amount of work to utilize that design from Linux and C++, right, or in that implementation aspect. And I just want to use aspects of that here, right, but while at the same time utilizing the efficiencies of C# and .NET and the tooling that's available there. That was the screenshot of that code snippet that I want to use later on, just as a starting point for moving the API into practical implementation in this code base, right? So I've already went through here, and I had studied more about this API, and you'll see that I'm already bringing in the what's called the syndication feed instance, and then I'm iterating through items from the RSS feed. And believe me, if you've watched my videos and looked at my previous GitHub repository progress, this is child's play compared to what I worked with over a 7-year period. And so while I still greatly revere those other implementations, this is definitely a cakewalk by comparison, and it reflects, you know, the huge difference in terms of what we really mean by productivity in the older days, right? In the old days, it was always this debate about C++ and everything else, and that C++ was always considered, at least in a backhanded comment kind of way, as slower to write code with, slower to get actual results. And in 2023, that hasn't changed. That hasn't changed, and that doesn't diminish the other numerous reasons why you would actually endeavor to use C++ for building a high-grade software application, right? I would still, lean on C++ for a high-grade commercial application. As I said in an earlier video, that's not what I'm attempting to build here. I'm building more of the quality of application you would see in a corporate setting or a business setting, where productivity and the timeliness of delivering software and updates to that software are more of an emphasis. One of the things that I was looking at on this API was the idea of the URL associated with an article. And so at first I was like, I would have just liked to have had a property, in this case, a value that was just the URL, but I see the wisdom in this design where you actually have a collection of URLs, some of which may be alternative URLs, some of them may be caption URLs, some of them may be image URLs. And so all the URLs relate. I'm going to take a shortcut in my initial draft of the software code here, and I'm just going to access the first element of the collection. That's usually going to throw a index out of bounds exception or some type like that, right? In the worst case, that's what would happen. But I'm actually not concerned about that. I'm more concerned about expressing in code at this point the overall intent. I'm expressing the overall intent of the design, right? And here, this is more about retrieving the values in general from one API to another, right? And so with that last line of code right there, I've pretty much accomplished that, right? So what you're looking at is just the nucleus of the cell, as it were. If this was an organism, what you're looking at on the screen right now is the nucleus of the cell, and you could say is practically the heart of the software application. It's so simple, right? I mean, this one aspect here, retrieving the data from the internet, right? And I'm doing that by proxy by using a local file, right? But you're retrieving the data, and then you are accessing that information and putting it into another API, into another collection, and then you're going to forward that collection to other parts of the application, right? And so in a more complete implementation, which will follow after this, that's going to include putting the data in an SQLite database, and then also then accessing that SQLite database to feed the user interface. And before it's lost in comment, the reason why you would do it that way is because you're not always going to access the data from the internet site, right? Because you want to make sure that you are accessing the data at infrequent intervals so as not to access the sites too frequently or to violate the access preferences of the internet operators or the website operators. And so using a cached database is going to be the way to do that, where you're comparing the last timestamp when you accessed the website. So, but the next step is to test out this conversion process and make sure it's solid. And once it is, then the goal will be to move to SQLite proper.